Okay, America, we need to talk. So recently I read a CNBC article that cited a bank rate survey that found that 50% of Americans, I believe it was 56% of Americans, couldn't cover a $1,000 emergency expense. And more recently than that, Prudential did a survey in which they found that 50% of Americans couldn't cover a $500 emergency. That means that half of respondents were living paycheck to paycheck. And here's the deal. The quickest way to ensure you aren't building wealth is by living paycheck to paycheck. So today we're going to talk about emergency savings and how that could help you build wealth. So we all know that life happens. In fact, in the month of March, my wife and I had $5,000 in emergency expenses. This comes just a few months after having our first child and all of the expenses associated with that. Life happens, and it happens at the worst possible moment. And if you don't have money to cover emergency expenses, you'll either be forced to borrowing money or into making a decision that's not optimal for your finances. For example, one of the expenses was a car repair. It would have been very easy if we didn't have any kind of emergency savings to throw our hands up in the air and say we need to go get a new car. I say that to say if you don't have any emergency savings, oftentimes one bad thing leads to another and it turns into a perpetual cycle of debt or dumb decisions. We've all been there before, but you don't have to stay there. According to the surveys that we discussed earlier, nearly 50% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. What that means is they make $100,000 a year, they spend $100,000 a year. Living paycheck to paycheck is the quickest way to ensure you don't build wealth. Because wealth is all about what you keep. Wealth is not what you see. Wealth is not what you spend. Wealth is what you keep. So keeping a portion of your income is how you begin to build wealth. But like we said at the beginning of this, life happens to everyone. It doesn't matter if you have no debt and an emergency fund, or if you have $20,000 in credit card debt and $80,000 in student loans. Life is going to happen. So if you're one of those 50% of Americans who are living paycheck to paycheck with no emergency savings, what should you do? Well, I'm glad you asked. So we've all heard financial gurus say, you need to have 3 to 6 months of emergency expenses saved. But what do you do if you're living paycheck to paycheck and you're drowning in debt and you feel like you can't keep your head above the water? Well, many people would say, start small. For example, the first of Dave Ramsey's 7 baby steps is to save up $1,000 as a starter emergency fund. $1,000 isn't a tremendous amount of money, but what it does is, in his words, give you a quick win and ensure if there is something that comes up later, you'll at least have a portion of money to cover that cost. Another popular method is the Money Guy's financial order of operation, in which the first step is to have deductibles covered. This means you would want your highest deductible saved as an emergency fund. So for example, you may have a $250 deductible on your car, but you might have a $2,500 deductible on your homeowner's insurance. Well, you would want to save $2,500 as your starter emergency fund. Now, while I'm no financial expert, I tend to agree that starting small is the best way to go about it. It does give you a small win, like Dave Ramsey says, and it allows you to move on to possibly greater priorities. For example, if you have $20,000 in credit card debt at a 23% interest rate, that is a financial emergency. And it makes no sense to try and save 3 to 6 months of living expenses while you have that kind of debt hanging over your head. So start small, but start today. Many people have found that they can make $1,000 pretty quickly by selling stuff that they have in their home or doing a couple of side jobs. This isn't something that should take you long to do. Getting that small starter emergency fund is the priority. If you don't have any kind of savings, you need a buffer between your finances and life. As we have established, life happens, and it happens at the worst possible time. And the way you can ensure you are meeting your other financial goals is to have a buffer. The reason you need a small emergency fund to get started is because you likely have other goals. You likely want to pay off debt or begin investing. But all of that comes after your small starter emergency fund, because the second that life happens, you may get discouraged, and you want to have something acting as a buffer between your financial goals and life happening. So whatever you choose as your starter emergency fund, be intense about getting there. Sell some stuff you have around the house on Facebook Marketplace, or find a couple of side jobs that you can do here or there. Anything to ensure in a month or 2 months you have everything you need for a starter emergency fund. This makes me need a cup of coffee. Okay, now that we know we need a starter emergency fund, the question is, where do we keep it? Well, here's an important financial term. Oh no, the card is full. And that brings up a very fancy financial term, liquidity. Liquidity simply means the ability for you to access it. For example, you wouldn't want to invest your emergency fund in the stock market because it may just be you lose your job right as the stock market tanks, or your hot water heater chooses to go out when the stock market is down by 28%. You want to have immediate access to it, and you don't want the risk of your emergency fund going down. So what I do is I put it in a high yield savings account that is separate from my day-to-day checking account. The reason I put it in a high yield savings account is so that it earns some interest, but it's not at risk of losing money. If it's sitting there, it might as well be working for me. Now, interest rates are higher than they have been in the last few years, so you can find a number of high yield savings accounts online that are offering pretty good rates. Ally is one of them. That's what I happen to use personally. I don't get anything for saying that, but you should check them out. Marcus by Goldman Sachs. In fact, Apple just announced a high yield savings account with just over a 4% interest rate. That's wonderful, especially if you're in the Apple ecosystem. If you're not in the Apple ecosystem, what are you doing? This is for another video. The point is, they're abundant. So do your research, make sure you're putting your money in a reputable institution that's FDIC insured, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter which one you go with. Now, why do I keep my emergency fund separate from my day-to-day checking account? Well, remember when we talked about that word liquidity? We want easy access to our emergency fund, but we don't want it to be too easy. What I mean by that is, you probably don't want your emergency fund sitting around your house in cash. You do want a little bit of space between yourself and your emergency fund so you're not tempted to spend it on whatever you want to purchase that day. It can be easy to justify spending when we think we need something, but remember, this money is saved for emergencies. So you may have the discipline to keep it at the same institution as your checking account is, and if that's you, great. No arguments from me. But I like to keep it at a separate institution just for that much more separation. So then the natural question is, what constitutes an emergency? Well, you're going to have to know yourself when it comes to this. You don't want to spend your emergency fund on lifestyle upgrades. You need to have the discipline to leave it there for an unexpected expense. You really want to keep your emergency fund for true emergencies. When the transmission in the car goes out, when you need your AC unit replaced, whatever it may be, a genuine emergency that you would otherwise have to borrow money in order to cover. It needs to act as the buffer between you and life. So, you have your starter emergency fund saved in a high yield savings account, and you are waiting for Murphy to show up. Congratulations. That's a wonderful first step. You have mastered not one, but two financial skills, because in this process, you have learned to spend less than you make and the discipline of saving. Those are the financial skills that are going to carry you on to financial success. The one reason you might not become a millionaire is because you don't master those two. But if you have mastered living on less than you make and the discipline of saving, those could take you on to building tremendous wealth. So what are your next steps? Well, now that you have a slight buffer from life happening, you can pay down high interest debt. You can learn to invest your money. You can be more charitable. Or you may be moving on to the next step, which is saving that 3 to 6 months of emergency expenses so you have a much larger buffer. Whatever your next step is, you will be happy that you have this starter emergency fund to keep you on track. You can reach your financial goals, but you don't want to be derailed in the first few months of trying. So I hope this video has been helpful. I hope it's been motivating and informative, educational. Remember, I'm not a financial advisor and none of this is necessarily financial advice, but I do hope you take what you have learned here, apply it to your life in some way so that you can build the financial future that you want. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, like, share it with your friends, and tell us below, what's your starter emergency fund goal? We'd love to know. Thank you for watching.